The Dreamland Motel has played host to some of the world's most enigmatic characters over the decades, and we do our best not to ask too many questions. Your business is your business. As long as whatever it is you're doing quietens after 10 p.m, you're welcome here. Some guests don't check out in the traditional way. We'll wake up to a key left on a neatly made bed and a small bundle of cash on the bedside table, sometimes with a comment card that simply says, "Thank you, that was the sleep I needed." This was the case for one guest I hadn't thought about in many years, until recently. What I'm going to show you wasn't actually found until a few years after he checked out, tucked delicately under the mattress in room 27. We found it during our biennial mattress flipping. It's right here in our lost and found. That's not it. Here it is. A journal. No name on the cover, but unmistakably his. I'd recognise that slightly childish handwriting anywhere. For the first couple of years, it just sat behind the desk. I never intended to read it, but the nights out here can get long and quiet. And I'll admit, curiosity does have a way of finding me. The entries go back decades. He's been writing since he was about 15, documenting everything. Most of it is ordinary, life as it comes and goes. But there's a point where things begin to change. I won't be sharing all of it, of course, but there's a particular stretch of entries that stayed with me, and I think it's been long enough now. So that's the story we're going to tell tonight. Before we begin, I want to welcome you back to the Dreamland Motel. If you've been here before, it's good to see you again. If you're new here, feel free to settle in, and if you like, leave your own comment card down below. And to our residential guests and those supporting the motel behind the scenes, thank you. Without you, the bar would still be watering down the vodka. If you're interested in contributing a little extra, you'll find details down below. Now, get comfortable. Let's take a walk back to room 27 and begin. February 5th, 1988. The Cold War continues to escalate, despite visibly tired populations on both sides. It's difficult to tell whether people have grown used to it or simply learned to carry it more quietly. I was born into it, and I've never known anything else. Still, I find myself wondering what it would feel like to live in a world where that tension doesn't exist in the background of everything, where the idea of nuclear annihilation isn't something you account for, even subconsciously. Today's protest was built around that same question, though expressed more directly. It was organised against the continued proliferation of nuclear weapons, and by the time I arrived, the crowd had already settled into that familiar, steady rhythm. There were banners and signs, most of them handwritten, some carefully prepared, but others rushed. The tone itself wasn't chaotic, but just dense. People talking over one another, listening in fragments, occasionally joining together in chants that never quite established themselves. I myself didn't go there to make noise. I tend to stay on the edges of these things, observing more than participating, trying to understand the shape of what's being said rather than adding to it myself. That habit is probably the reason I didn't notice him until it was too late. I turned, or someone shifted beside me, and I walked directly into him. The first thing I registered was the impact. followed immediately by the sound of a cup hitting the pavement. Coffee spread out across the ground between us, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. I apologized, of course. He looked down at the spill, then back at me with an expression that felt like an opportunity rather than annoyance. "You've just cost me a perfectly good coffee," he said. There was no real hostility in it, but it was clear enough that I offered to replace it. He accepted without hesitation, and we stepped out of the crowd together into a nearby cafe. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. The noise of the protest softened into something distant, auxiliary, replaced by the quieter, more contained sounds of cups, low conversation, and movement behind the counter. I bought him another coffee and set it down in front of him. He acknowledged it with a small nod. All was forgiven, and for a moment I thought that might be the end of the interaction. "You're a student," he said after a pause. I nodded. "Here, yes, at Stanford." "What are you studying?" "Accelerator physics, beam dynamics, mostly. I've been doing some postgraduate work connected to the Linear Collider project." That seemed to interest him more than any of the surrounding conversations. He leaned back slightly, studying me in a way that felt like a calculation. "And you're out there protesting nuclear weapons," he said. It wasn't framed as a question, but I answered it anyway. "Yes." "Why?" he said. I took a moment before responding. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because it felt like a question laced with trickery. "Because we've built something that operates beyond meaningful control," I said. "The scale of it leaves no room for correction. It only has to fail once, and the consequences are final. I don't think that's something we should be expanding." He listened without interruption, which made it easier to continue. "At the same time," I added, "the level of innovation required to build those systems could be directed somewhere else, toward energy, for example. There are areas we haven't fully explored yet, and I think that's where the real frontier is." He gave a faint smile at that, one that suggested recognition more than agreement. "You're talking about standing at the edge of something new," he said. "Yes," I replied. "That's where I'd like to be." He picked up his coffee, took a measured sip and set it back down before asking his next question. "Where do you see yourself in 10 years? It caught me slightly off guard, but the answer came easily enough. "At the frontier of a new form of energy production," I said, "wherever that may end up being." He watched me for a few seconds after that, as if weighing the answer against something unspoken. "What if you could stand on that frontier in the next month?" he asked. I wasn't sure how to respond to that. "I don't understand," I said. He tilted his head slightly, studying me once more. "You know who I am, don't you?" I did. "You're Edward Teller." He nodded once, as though confirming something long established. "I've stood on that frontier before," he said, "and there's no requirement that I ever stepped away from it." There was a pause, long enough for the meaning of that to evolve. "If you're serious about changing the direction of things," he continued, "I may have something for you." He reached into his pocket and placed a small piece of paper on the table between us. An address, a date, and a time. Nothing more. "Be there," he said. I looked down at it, then back up. but he was already standing. "Don't be late." And just like that, he stepped back out into the protest, disappearing into the same crowd we'd just left behind. His coffee on the table, almost full. I stayed in the cafe for a while after that, the paper still in front of me. It's with me now, tucked between these pages. I haven't made a decision yet. At least, that's what I'm telling myself. February 22nd. It feels like I'm sleeping with the enemy. Teller, brilliant though he is, represents something I've spent years pushing against. The application of technology without any meaningful consideration for its consequences. That may be an unfair simplification, but it's difficult to separate the man from what he helped bring into the world. Even so, around 3 o'clock this afternoon, I was still wondering whether I'd made the right decision coming down here to Burbank. I still have his piece of paper in my pocket, even now. Truthfully, I haven't let it out of my possession since he handed it to me. I don't know. Coming from a man like Teller, it feels like a kind of security clearance. Hell, I might even frame it. What he wrote on it wasn't a joke either. The building itself didn't stand out in any meaningful way. It sat among others of similar shape and size, clean and unremarkable, with no obvious indication of what went on inside. If anything, it felt intentionally forgettable. The only detail that gave it any distinction at all was a small discreet sign. EG&G Special Projects. I arrived early, which gave me time to observe the entrance. People came and went without drawing attention to themselves. No uniforms, no visible security presence beyond what you might expect from any private facility. It would have been easy to walk past it without a second glance. Inside, the atmosphere was more controlled, though not overtly restrictive. A reception desk, a waiting area, a few closed doors along a quiet corridor. I gave my name, the one I'd been told to use, and I was asked to take a seat. No questions beyond that. No visible verification of who I was. Apparently they were expecting me. After a short wait, I was led into a small room by a man who introduced himself only by his first name. He didn't offer a role or a title, and I didn't ask for one. The room itself was plain. A table, 2 chairs, no windows. There was a folder already placed in front of where I was asked to sit. To be clear, I'm pretty sure this was a job interview. I guess I'll find out. But the interview began without any real introduction. They didn't ask me about any physics. That was the first thing that stood out. Instead, they asked me about my life, where I grew up, who I spent time with, what I did outside of my studies at Stanford. The questions were simple on the surface, but they were structured in a way that made it difficult to answer casually. I got a sense that the details really mattered. Dates, names, patterns of behavior. It wasn't enough to say what I did. They wanted to understand how and why. At first, it felt like just an intense background check. But that impression didn't last. The same questions began to reappear, slightly altered each time. The phrasing would change or the context would shift, but the core of it would remain the same. They would circle back to earlier answers, approaching them from a different angle, attacking, watching closely for hesitation or inconsistency. It became clear fairly quickly that this wasn't about gathering information. They were testing me. How often do you speak to your parents? You mentioned weekly earlier. Has that changed recently? What do you typically discuss when you do? Have you ever withheld information from them intentionally? The pattern repeated across every single area of my life. Friends, relationships, habits. Nothing was too small to revisit, and nothing was accepted at face value. At one point, I tried to steer the conversation back toward the reason I was there. What exactly is this position? I asked. The man across from me didn't answer directly. If you're selected, he said, your responsibilities will be made clear to you. Okay, so he didn't know. But it was the closest thing to a confirmation I received. After some time, I lost track of how long. The questions stopped as abruptly as they had begun. The man closed his folder, stood, and told me to follow him. We moved into another room, larger this time, with a stack of documents waiting on the table. This part was more familiar. On paper, I may be just a student, but I'm well aware of the technological applications of the knowledge I've been taught as a postgrad. Non-disclosure agreements, several of them. Security acknowledgements, written in dense formal language that seemed designed to be read very, very slowly. Clauses about information handling, communication restrictions, and consequences that were stated clearly enough to leave no room for interpretation. There was also a section for next of kin. That gave me pause, not because it was unusual. Forms like that appear in many contexts, but because of how it was presented. It wasn't optional. It wasn't treated as routine. It sat there amongst the other documents as something that needed to be completed with care. I filled it out before I'd even finished reading. No one rushed me, but there was an understanding that this wasn't a process to linger over unnecessarily. Once everything was signed, the documents were collected without comment. That's all for today, the man said. I expected more, some kind of explanation, or at least the next step. When will I hear back? I asked. He looked at me for a moment, then gave a small, almost polite nod. You'll be contacted. That was it. March 16th. I haven't written anything in a couple of weeks. It's been a bit of a scramble since the interview. I received a call the following day. No preamble or explanation, but I did receive the confirmation that I'd been accepted. I got the job, though I still don't know what the job actually is. That uncertainty should probably bother me more than it does, but I get the sense that whatever this is, it matters. That seems to be enough for now. I did expect some resistance from the university when I submitted my request to pause my postgraduate work. The timing alone would have raised questions. Instead, I was told that a sabbatical had already been arranged on my behalf. It was presented to me as if I should have already known. No one seemed surprised. No one asked for any clarification. I didn't know how to respond to that. Finding somewhere to live down here, however, has proven more difficult. It turns out that being a student on sabbatical, unable to provide any details about employment, income, or even a job title, doesn't inspire much confidence in landlords. Applications tend to stall once those sections are left blank. I tried to explain it once or twice, but there isn't really a version of the truth that sounds reasonable when I speak it out loud. After a few days of searching, I came across a small place just outside of town. It took longer to find than it perhaps should have, though that may have more to do with the way everything is laid out here. The roads don't feel entirely intuitive. You follow one for long enough, and it gives the impression that you're getting somewhere, only to realize you've looped back into somewhere familiar. There's a sameness to the landscape that makes it difficult to stay oriented. The place is called the Dreamland Motel. From the outside it looks exactly like what it is, a row of low buildings, a parking lot that's seen better days, and a neon sign that's far too loud, even in the daylight. It isn't the kind of place you'd choose unless you had a reason. But the management were welcoming enough, and they didn't ask many questions. That, more than anything else, made the decision easy. Cash was also accepted without hesitation, and whatever details I chose not to offer weren't pursued. There seemed to be a quiet understanding to the exchange that I appreciated, especially after everything that's happened over the past few weeks. So now I'm all settled in, here in room 27. It's a simple space: bed, desk, small bathroom, a window that looks out onto the lot. Everything is where it should be, but there is something about the proportions that feel slightly off. I can't quite place it. The room isn't uncomfortable, just difficult to settle into at first, but comforting once you get used to it. There are other long-term guests here. You can tell by the way they move through the space, the routine of not having to think about where you're going. Most of them keep to themselves. There seems to be an unspoken agreement not to intrude, which suits me well enough. Oddly, I'm starting to feel like I may have found my tribe. There's an unusual kind of quiet, not empty, sort of confined, and for reasons I don't fully understand, I find it easy to relax here. Tonight will be my third night. There's a stillness in the room now that wasn't noticeable at first, like an absence of the small, expected sounds. I found myself listening for something without knowing what it was. Pipes, maybe. Movement behind the walls. Just something to suggest the place is behaving normally. Anyway, everything seems in order, and the unending wait continues. I've been told I'll be contacted, but I'm not sure they even know where I'm staying. Oh, and I've decided to start writing more regularly again. There's enough uncertainty in what I'm stepping into that it feels worth keeping a record of. If nothing else, it might help me keep track of the monotony. I'll leave it there tonight. Who knows? Maybe tomorrow I'll start figuring out what this job actually is. March 17th. My life changed today, though I'm not entirely sure what it's changed into. I'm not surprised that facilities like this exist. It would be naive to assume otherwise. Still, I had no idea of the sense of scale. What I saw today wasn't a base. It was more like a whole country. Something vast, structured, and entirely disconnected from everything around it. I'm getting ahead of myself. It's probably better to start at the beginning. The call came at 3 a.m. The phone in the room began ringing, but it didn't bother me. I was only dreaming of being stuck in the room anyway. I remember sitting up almost immediately, already half aware that this was the moment I'd been waiting for. The front desk transferred the call through. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Janet. Her tone was calm, reassuring, pleasant in a way, as if she were used to waking people at that hour. She confirmed my name, then gave me a set of instructions. I was to be ready within the hour. Transportation would take me to a private flight departing at approximately 5:15 a.m. from McCarran. She spoke clearly, efficiently, and didn't repeat anything unless I asked. When I did ask a question, something simple about what I should expect, she paused just long enough to acknowledge it, then continued, as if it hadn't been asked at all. Before ending the call, she told me to bring identification and nothing unnecessary. And that was it. The line went quiet, and for a few seconds I remained sitting on the edge of the bed, letting the room settle around me. There was a moment, brief but noticeable, where everything felt suspended, like I had stepped slightly out of sync with the rest of the world. And then it passed. The drive to the airport was uneventful, forcefully so. I had tried several times to make small talk with the driver, but he ignored everything I said. Everything. After a while I realized he was telling me the rules without telling me anything. Like the air, the roads were empty at that hour, an emptiness that makes distances like these painful to experience. By the time I arrived at McCarran, there were already a few others waiting. No one spoke. The aircraft itself was unmarked, no airline branding, no identifiers that I could see, except for a solitary red strip running the length of the fuselage. Boarding was silent, orderly. Names and IDs were checked against a list, and despite this being my first time, I wasn't treated any differently. We took off just after 5:15 a.m. The flight was short, but not rushed. We were just high enough in altitude to see the sun rising somewhere else, just beyond the horizon, its light reaching upward in a muted amber glow that stretched across the edge of the sky. From that vantage point, I began to understand the scale of what lay below. The Nellis Air Force Range extended outward in all directions, its boundaries suggested only by the shifting shapes of mountain ranges and the scattered clusters of light marking distant installations. The air was so clear that even from that height, the desert details held together in a way that felt over-amplified. Individual Joshua trees stood out against the pale desert floor, their shapes distinct, almost too real. It really was beautiful. Those few minutes have stayed with me. There was something about that view that felt final, though I couldn't have explained why at the time. But looking back on it now, I think those were the last moments that still felt connected to an ordinary life. When we landed, the landscape outside had already shifted into something more barren, more open, processed, scarred. The air felt different as I stepped off the plane, drier, less hospitable. That was where I met Dennis. He was waiting for me at the bottom of the aircraft stairs, already moving with purpose as I approached. There was no formal introduction, just a brief acknowledgement before he guided me toward a small structure nearby. A guard shack, though the term feels slightly generous. It was functional, compact, and divided into a couple of small rooms. He led me into one of them, gestured toward a desk, and told me to read everything carefully. Then he left. The documents were already laid out in neat stacks. Every single one, however, I'd already read, interrogated, and signed back at EG&G Special Projects. Why would they make me sign them again? Was there a problem with my signatures? Or are things so disconnected out here that contracts and paperwork get lost in the transfer all the time? I signed them all again without reading, expecting to be questioned as to how I could possibly be done so quickly. But when I signalled to Dennis waiting outside, he didn't even ask if I had any questions. He simply collected the documents, glanced through them briefly, and nodded. "Come on," he said. It was around that moment I began to understand Dennis a little better. There was nothing overtly unfriendly about him, but there was a distance there, a kind of practiced efficiency. He wasn't concerned with me in any personal sense. Everything he did followed a sequence, a checklist he seemed intent on moving through as cleanly as possible. He carried himself like military, even without saying it outright. Well-built, posture straight without being rigid, movements economical. His hair was cut short, practical, and the least defiant mustache you could get away with. The sort that suggested he knew exactly how far he could go without being told otherwise, but decided not to push the boundary anyway. There wasn't an ounce of defiance in him, at least not on the surface, just discipline, and a clear preference for getting things done without unnecessary delay. I followed him out without saying anything further. We stepped outside and walked toward a blue bus parked a short distance away. The windows were covered in a dark film, opaque enough to prevent any clear view inside or out. We boarded together, and I took a seat on the right-hand side a few rows back. Dennis sat opposite, staring at me. For the first part of the journey, there was nothing to see. The blackout film did its job well, turning the outside world into a uniform darkness. I could see out the windshield, but the landscape was ambiguous and just as repetitive as the inside of the bus. It wasn't until I noticed a small irregularity, just behind Dennis's shoulder, that I realized there was a section where the film had begun to peel away. It was only a few inches across, but it was enough. Through that gap, I could see us making our way over a dry lake bed stretching out beside us. Flat, pale, and almost featureless at a distance. As we moved, a few details began to take shape. There was a cargo container positioned off to one side, the kind you'd expect to see on a shipping vessel. Nearby, in a separate area, were several pallets wrapped tightly in plastic. Even from that distance, they looked ordinary. Boxes stacked and secured in a way that suggested a routine delivery, the kind of supplies you might find in vending machines. It was an odd contrast. Further out near the edge of the lake bed, I caught sight of a helicopter moving low along the horizon. An MH-47, if I'm not mistaken. A Chinook. It was already pulling away, just below the line of the mountains, as if it had only recently completed a drop. The journey itself had taken around 40 minutes in total, long enough to feel removed from where we'd started. But I'll be honest, I know nothing of that whole range. We could have driven in circles all that time, and I'd never have known. The bus came to a stop, and we stepped out into a space that felt enclosed, though there was no obvious boundary. It was the bus that was blocking much of my view of anything other than a narrowing passage leading to an unmarked door in the side of a large hill. There was a single dust-whipped security camera outside, pointing down at it. The entrance itself was understated. Clearly a section of the rock had been cut away, just enough to allow access. Inside, the environment shifted again. The first point of contact was a security desk. There was a single military man seated behind it. He barely looked up as we approached, offering nothing more than a brief glance in Dennis's direction before gesturing us through. It wasn't indifference, he just clearly knew who Dennis was, and Dennis isn't a man you easily impersonate. Dennis didn't slow down. We moved into the next room, which was almost completely empty. The only feature of note was a device mounted on a stand near the far wall. Hand, Dennis said. The machine was labelled Identimat 2000. Given its name, I knew this was some sort of scanner, and I placed my hand onto it as instructed. It emitted a hot light down onto the back of my hand, and after a few seconds, a soft beep. Then Dennis told me to do it again. I repeated the process, holding still until it completed its cycle. A moment later, a badge popped out. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. There was a photograph on it. I don't remember having that photograph taken. On the bottom, a disjointed sequence of letters and numbers with an off-center red circle stamped over S4. I'm going to assume that's where I was. On the right-hand side, 3 large letters, M-A-J. Before I had time to consider it further, Dennis gestured toward the next door. "Use it," he said. The badge worked immediately. The door unlocked without calculation, as if it had already been configured for me. On the other side, the layout opened up slightly, but not really. Just a very long corridor, clean and evenly lit, with several doors spaced along each side. Very tired and bored security guards were posted every 40 feet or so. I was directed into the first door on the right, a medical room. The tests were quick, efficient to the point of feeling rushed. Blood samples, basic checks, and an allergen test that left a faint irritation along my arm. The doctor, if that's what she was, didn't offer much in the way of conversation. "If you feel any nausea," she said, "come straight back here." There was no context for that instruction, but I nodded anyway. From there, Dennis led me further down the corridor to another room. This one was set up similarly to the first I'd been in at the guard shack, though slightly smaller and darker. A table, a chair, and an office light that was at least 10 years old. There were several blue folders arranged neatly in front of me. Dennis told me to read them, then left. As he shut the door behind him, I immediately felt a sense of relief. For the first time since 3 this morning, I could actually stop and take a few seconds to process what had just happened. The insanity of the day so far. I sat there, hands resting on the table, and let out a quiet laugh to myself. It wasn't nerves exactly, more just the release of it all. It was a strange feeling, sitting out here in the middle of nowhere, in this nowhere place that doesn't exist on any map. I know what kind of explosions shaped this landscape. I know what sort of experiments took place out here decades ago. What kind of work justified carving entire facilities into mountains. And yet here I was, apparently stepping into whatever came next. I remember trying to make sense of it in that moment, thinking that maybe in some strange way, all of that destruction had led to this, that whatever I was about to be involved in might represent something different, a step forward instead of backward. It felt like a convenient conclusion to land on, but it was enough to steady me at the time. I know how that sounds. Still, it didn't feel as insane as what came next. I picked up the first thick blue folder and began reading. At first, it read like an advanced research briefing, the kind you might expect to see attached to a high-level project. There were references to energy systems, propulsion concepts, field interactions, all presented in a way that suggested progression beyond current public understanding, but still grounded enough to follow. I'd read far more technical language at university, and even encountered crazier theoretical physics papers written by drunken roommates the evening of the submission deadline. Then a name started appearing repeatedly. Project Aquarius, an umbrella term, not a single project but a collection of them. Everything seemed to sit beneath it, compartmentalized, separated into smaller initiatives that each focused on a different aspect of the work. The first of those was labelled Sidekick. That one was easier to interpret. The language was more direct, more outcome-focused. It described a weapons program, though not in the conventional sense. There were references to controlled energy output, containment, directional application. It was written in a way that assumed the reader already understood the implications. I understood the premise all right, but how it got there was vague, even cryptic. The language was circling an unacknowledged reality. The next section was titled Looking Glass. This one was different. The tone shifted, and the language became more abstract. There were discussions around time, though not in the way it's usually framed. It spoke about observation, variation, and the ability to look somewhere else along a timeline. It didn't explain how, and it didn't try to simplify it. It just stated it plainly. I know general relativity is old news at this point, and broadly well understood, but I'm also aware that the language needed to properly describe whatever Looking Glass was attempting to convey doesn't really exist yet, not in any formal sense. And judging by how this briefing was written, it wasn't exactly coming from a group of scientists that finished top of their class. Some of it read like it had been put together by people trying to run before they could walk. Concepts stacked on top of each other, without the structure to properly support them. Terminology used in ways that felt odd, not quite right. It had that unmistakable feel of something being actively worked on, rather than something that had been settled. Even so, there was something about it that held my attention. Beneath the rough edges, there was a direction there, something that suggested this wasn't theoretical in the usual sense, but reactive, like they were trying to describe something they had already observed, and were still catching up to it. If that was the case, then whatever Looking Glass actually was, it was ahead of anything I'd seen before. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't interested in being involved in it, if that ever became an option. Then came Galileo. That one felt closer to my field. The moment I read it, I knew I'd be working on it. Energy and propulsion, systems that I could at least partially relate to. But even there, things didn't quite line up. The outputs being described didn't match anything I'd worked with before. Not even close. The efficiencies didn't make sense within any framework I understood. Up to that point, I could still convince myself that this was simply advanced research, highly classified, tightly controlled, but still ours. That's when the wording began to change. Certain sections felt like they had been rewritten, the same ideas presented more than once, slightly adjusted each time. It was as if the document had been refined to guide the reader not just through an intellectual journey, but an emotional one too. Each paragraph became harder to accept. Each header became more ridiculous. But all the while, I was reminded where I was. I was reading these briefings under armed guard. For lack of a better phrase, under this context, what I read was shocking, deeply. There were references to recovered systems, obtained, studied, and partially understood. Further down, the language evolved gently. Extraterrestrial origin. I remember stopping there, just sitting back in the chair, letting that phrase settle in. I read it again, slower this time, but it didn't change. By the time I reached the end of the material, the structure of the document had made its intention very clear. It hadn't started with the whole truth. It had built toward it, gradually, in a way that made it easier to accept by the time you arrived there. Some of the technology outlined in those folders wasn't developed by us. It wasn't theoretical. It wasn't even experimental in the way I understood the word. It existed, and it wasn't human. I closed the folder and sat there for a while, the room feeling quieter than it had before. There was a small window on the door, and I knew Dennis had checked on me through it at least once. He would have seen me just sitting there, staring at the wall in silence. But he didn't come in. It felt like a deliberate choice, like he understood that whatever I was processing in that moment, it wasn't something that could be rushed through. The most straightforward way past it was to just sit with it for a few minutes and let it settle on its own. So I did. I didn't reach for the folder again. I just sat there, letting everything I'd read run back through my head, trying to make sense of it in some coherent way. It didn't really come together. After a while, the room did start to feel normal again, or at least familiar enough that I could stand up without thinking too much about it. I picked up the folder, closed it properly, and left it where it was. Whatever this place was, whatever I had agreed to, I was now unequivocally part of it. But that apparently was enough for one day. By early afternoon, everything had reversed just as efficiently as it had begun. I was back on a flight to McCarran by around 1 p.m. The same quiet process, but in reverse. No explanations and nothing clarified. The transition felt almost unreal, like stepping out of a bubble, and something continued on without me the moment I left. It's now just after 4 p.m. I'm sat at the motel bar, a couple of vodkas in, though I'm fairly certain they've been watering it down. The place is quiet at this hour, a few people scattered around, keeping to themselves, the same way they always do. No one asks questions here, which feels more important now than it ever did before. I've been trying to decide whether today actually happened. There's a part of me that wants to reduce it to something more manageable. A test, maybe. An elaborate filtering process to see how I'd react under pressure, how I'd handle ambiguity. Perhaps how far I'd be willing to follow instructions without understanding them. That would make sense. It would be easier to accept. But then there's the alternative. And it's the alternative that I believe. I haven't been told anything beyond "we'll be in touch." No timeline, no indication of what comes next. Just an open space where answers should be. If the last stretch of time at the motel felt slow, this next period already feels like it's going to stretch even further. Waiting without context has a way of turning hours into something heavier. I keep coming back to the folders, to what I read. Was it real? Less than a couple 100 miles from where I'm sitting right now, somewhere out past a dry lake bed in the Nevada desert, there may be things that don't belong to us. Systems that operate beyond anything we've formally developed. Sitting in a facility that isn't meant to exist. Technology that could change the world in the way I've always wanted. And somehow, I've been placed at the edge of it. March 24th. It was an unbearably long couple of weeks. I had a lot of time to process, to rethink my first experience, to try and rationalize it into something that made sense. I went over it again and again, adjusting details in my head, recalculating what I thought I understood, trying to bring it back within the boundaries of something I can accept. Eventually, I settled on the more mundane explanations. At one point, I genuinely believed it had all been part of some elaborate game show, and I was just the butt of some joke. It sounds ridiculous written down, but at the time it felt far more reasonable than the alternative. But I've just returned to the motel after spending another day out there, and I can't maintain that explanation anymore. I know I shouldn't be writing any of this down, not after what I signed, but as long as I hide this journal somewhere in my room, somewhere it won't be found easily, I should be fine. At least I hope so. The call came early again. Same voice, same tone, same lack of detail. I'd missed Janet. I followed the same process without really thinking about it this time. The drive, the flight, the landing, Dennis waiting at the bottom of the stairs, as if he hadn't moved from that spot since I'd left. There was less ceremony to it today, no need to repeat what had already been done. The system recognized me, and everything moved faster because of it. Even the bus ride felt shorter, though I'm sure it wasn't. I caught a glimpse through the same peeled section in the window, the same dry lake bed stretching out beside us, but this time I didn't linger on it. My attention was elsewhere. When the bus came to a stop, it parked differently than before. For the first time, I stepped off with a clear, unobstructed view of where I actually was. The lake bed stretched out in full, wide and pale against the surrounding terrain, bordered by a mountain ridge that felt closer than I'd realized on the first visit. Standing there, with nothing obscuring the view, the scale of it became much easier to appreciate. And then I saw it. I had to look twice to be sure I wasn't misinterpreting what I was seeing. Set into the side of the mountain were hangars, large impressive structures cut directly into the rock, their outlines softened by a careful camouflage. From a distance they blended almost seamlessly into the natural contours of the ridge. Even up close, they didn't immediately stand out, unless you knew what you were looking for. The positioning of them was precise. The angle of the mountain kept them in shadow for most of the day, even under direct sunlight. This was thoughtful, layered concealment, designed to disappear not just from ground level, but from above as well. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, taking it in. There's no way the Soviets would have any idea this place exists. Not like this. Not with the way it's been built into the landscape. Even with their satellite capabilities. There's nothing obvious to lock onto. No signatures that wouldn't already be expected out here. From a distance, it would just look like another part of the range. Which I suppose is exactly the point. Then my body remembered it was early morning in March, and it urged me to get moving. By the time we stepped inside, I had already decided that whatever I saw next was going to be real. Dennis didn't say much as he led me further down the corridor, through one set of double doors, and then we stopped. "This is you," he said. That was the extent of the introduction. He opened the door and stepped aside. Inside was the lab. It wasn't overwhelming in size or even particularly impressive at first glance. If you asked someone with no scientific background to picture a laboratory, this is probably what they'd describe. Microscopes, oscilloscopes, thermal cyclers, all arranged in a way that felt more visually pleasing than practical. Useful tools, just not for me. As an accelerator physicist, most of it sat slightly outside my immediate field, and what struck me more than anything was how inefficiently it had all been laid out. It didn't feel like a space designed from the ground up for a specific purpose. more like something that had been assembled quickly, with whatever was available. There was a metallic object on one of the central workstations that immediately caught my eye. Smooth, compact, and unlike anything else in the room. I found myself drawn toward it almost without thinking, trying to make sense of its shape before I got too close. "Watkins!" Dennis's voice cut through the room sharply. A man at the far side of the lab looked up, clearly already aware of what was happening, but taking his time to acknowledge it. "Yeah," he replied, without much urgency. "Come meet your new partner." Watkins stood, brushed his hands together absent-mindedly, and made his way over. He gave me a quick once-over, the kind that takes in more than it appears to. He gave a small nod in Dennis's direction, and without a word, Dennis turned and left the room. Watkins watched the door close, then turned his attention back to me. He was a jolly-looking man, with a presence that felt immediately familiar despite the setting. Mid-40s, I'd guess. There was an ease to him, a kind of settled confidence that only rarely comes from experience. He looked like the sort of person who would wear t-shirts with ironic slogans every day of the week and never feel the need to explain them. "First day?" he asked. "Yeah." He nodded, as if that confirmed something he already knew. "All right," he said. "Let's start simple." He turned back toward the workstation and gestured for me to follow. The object I'd noticed earlier was positioned at the center, sitting on a flat, square base. "This is what you'll be working on," he said. Up close, the structure became clear. A hemisphere, smooth, metallic, almost perfectly uniform, resting on top of a flat plate. The proportions were unusual. The dome itself was roughly the size of a basketball, maybe slightly larger, and it sat neatly on a square base, about 15 inches across. There were no visible seams, no fastenings, nothing to suggest how the two parts connected, beyond the fact that they did. No wiring, no buttons, no connectors of any kind. It didn't look like something that had been assembled. It looked complete. "Cool. What is it?" I asked. Watkins gave a small shrug. "Depends on who you ask," he said. "We call it the reactor." He said it casually, as if the glamour had long dissipated. Before I could ask anything else, Watkins shifted his weight slightly and nudged something beneath the desk with his foot. It caught my attention immediately. Sitting casually on a rotating gimbal under the workstation was a cylindrical object, roughly 2 feet in diameter and about 4 feet long. At first glance, it looked almost industrial, like a section of pipe or a cut-down piece of machinery. But the longer I looked, the less that comparison held up. It shared the same muted pewter-grey tone as the reactor, a kind of brushed, non-reflective finish that absorbed light rather than catching it. The surface was smooth, but not polished. There was a texture to it, almost wax-like. There were no seams, no rivets, no fasteners of any kind. Every edge was rounded, softened in a way that made the whole thing look like it had been gently melted into its final shape. One end of it was open. Inside, lining the interior, were panels of a copper-coloured material, structured, though I couldn't immediately tell for what purpose. Watkins rotated the entire assembly with a subtle movement of his foot, adjusting its position without taking his hands off the workstation. "Had to get used to doing that," he said casually. "Been on my own for a while." He gave it another slight nudge, lining it up more precisely. "Watch this," he said. Nothing happened. I looked at him, waiting for some kind of result. "What?" I started. Watkins didn't look up. "Touch it," he said. "Touch the reactor." I hesitated for a fraction of a second, wondering if it was some sort of cruel hazing ritual for the newbies, then reached out. My hand slowed as it got closer, not because I intended it to, but because something resisted it, a pressure, subtle at first, then more defined the closer I moved. I pushed forward, it pushed back. It felt like trying to bring two identical poles of a magnet together, except far stronger. Not rigid or solid, responsive. The resistance adjusted to the force I applied, maintaining a constant separation between my hand and the surface. I couldn't get any closer. I tried again, pressing harder this time, expecting something to give, some threshold to break through. But there wasn't one. No matter how much force I applied, my hand stopped at the same invisible boundary, held in place by something I couldn't see, couldn't measure, and absolutely couldn't explain. I pulled back slowly, flexing my fingers slightly, as if that might help make sense of the sensation. It didn't. I looked at Watkins. He was watching me with a faint, knowing expression. "Yep," he said. "That's about where everyone gets to." That was the strangest moment of my entire life. For about 30 seconds. "Cool, right?" he said. I didn't respond. I was still looking at the reactor, trying to reconcile what I'd just felt with anything that made sense. "Wait till you see what it came out of." That stopped me. Whatever thoughts I'd been holding on to stalled completely. I broke my gaze from the reactor and looked at him properly for the first time. He held it for a second, then gave a small nod, as if confirming something to himself. Without another word, he stepped over to the door and knocked twice. It opened immediately. Dennis stepped in. Watkins leaned in slightly and spoke to him in a lowered voice. I couldn't make out what was being said exactly, but I could see the exchange clearly enough. Short, direct, with no wasted words. They both glanced over at me once or twice during it, measuring something I wasn't privy to. Dennis gave a small nod. Watkins stepped back. Dennis walked over to me. "We're going to go across the hallway," he said, "through the opposite door. You're going to look forwards, and only forwards, until I tell you you can move your head again." He paused. "Do you understand?" I nodded. "Good," he said, and he gestured toward the door. "Let's go." I followed him out into the corridor. The door closed behind us with a soft, controlled click. Dennis positioned himself slightly ahead of me, just enough to guide without needing to say any further. We crossed the hallway in just a few steps, stopping at a door directly opposite the lab. Dennis didn't open the door himself. Instead, he stepped slightly to the side and nodded toward the panel. "Swipe your card." I hesitated for a fraction of a second before doing it, because I noticed something. It was a small detail, but it stood out. Dennis never used his own card. Not once. It occurred to me briefly that perhaps the system was logging my movement, tracking where I went, where I accessed, how long I stayed. I imagined someone like Dennis wouldn't need to do that, but someone like me would. The door opened. On the other side was a hangar, and immediately I was able to orient myself in the facility as a whole. The space stretched out further than I could immediately take in. the ceiling high enough to swallow sound rather than reflect it. The air felt different in there, cooler, heavier, like it had been sitting undisturbed for quite some time. "Forward," Dennis said. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, and we walked. For about a minute, maybe a little longer. It's difficult to judge time when you're deliberately ignoring everything around you. I could see shapes in my peripheral vision, large and indistinct, just enough to give me that feeling of a mystery I want to solve. Every instinct I had told me to look, to take it in properly, especially after what I'd just experienced in the lab. But I didn't. The instruction had been clear, and by that point, I was beginning to understand the weight behind it. We approached a set of large connecting doors. Dennis pushed one side open, and we stepped through. "All right," he said, as the door closed behind us with a heavy final sound. "You can look now." So I turned, and that's when I saw the craft. "The bunt cake," Watkins called out in an introductory fashion. The shape was unmistakable, circular, smooth, rising up from the ground in a continuous curve toward a central raised section. The walls of the craft rippled as they followed the curve round. It was almost ornate in design, highly unusual. It sat directly on its underside, as if we didn't really know how to place it. It was larger than I expected, roughly 40 feet across, maybe 15 feet tall at its highest point. The proportions were precise, balanced, in no way accidental. The surface matched the reactor exactly, the same muted metallic tone, same smooth, seamless finish. No rivets, no panels, no indication that it had been assembled from separate parts. It was one continuous object, completely alien, and I had no idea what I was looking at. Watkins glanced over at Dennis, and Dennis gave another small nod. "You can take a look inside," Watkins said. I followed his line of sight and noticed, on the far side of the craft, a simple ladder leaning up against the hull. It looked almost out of place, crude, practical, very human. At the top was a small opening, a hatch, barely large enough to climb through comfortably. I made my way over slowly. The hangar was quiet, not silent, but close enough that every movement felt more pronounced. Even my own footsteps seemed to carry further than was necessary. I reached the ladder and paused for a moment, looking up at the opening. I rested a hand against it, briefly, before climbing. On my way up, I was very aware of how strange this was. A standard ladder, leaning against something that, by any reasonable assumption, should have been beyond value, and yet there it was, being treated like any other object. When I reached the top, I stopped and peered into the interior, which was dark. Not completely, but enough that it concealed more than it revealed. I could make out shapes, outlines, a structure within, but nothing distinct enough to understand from where I was. So I took a breath, fought my instincts, and pulled myself inside. The space was tighter than I expected. I had to stay on my hands and knees to move forward. The ceiling was much lower than the exterior shape suggested. The internal volume distributed differently than I would have assumed. There were openings, one above leading to some sort of upper section, one below descending further into the structure. The layout suggested multiple levels, though everything felt too compact, designed with efficiency rather than comfort in mind. It became immediately clear that this wasn't built for someone my size. But there were chairs, 2 of them, moulded directly into the floor, facing each other. No cushioning, no adjustment, no indication that they had ever been installed separately. Between them, extending down from the ceiling, was a cylindrical structure, sort of like a pipe, but obviously it probably wasn't. In truth, I have no idea. Directly beneath it, set into the floor, was a square indentation. I didn't need to measure it. I instantly knew. It matched the base of the reactor in the lab. That connection formed almost instantly. I might not understand the system as a whole, but some relationships were clear enough to recognize. The reactor wasn't just a component. It was central to the operation of the craft. As I sat there, trying to take it all in, a wave of nausea began to settle in. It wasn't sudden, more like a gradual shift in how the space felt, a pressure, or maybe just the weight of the realization itself. I was inside a craft that hadn't been built by humans. Something that had come from somewhere else, across distances I couldn't meaningfully comprehend, now sitting in a hangar carved into a mountain in the Nevada desert. And we didn't understand it, not properly. In that moment I felt something close to fear. Fear of the realization of how little we actually know. Everything around me functioned beyond any framework I had, and yet here it was, treated as something to be studied, dismantled, and I assume recreated. From below, Watkins' voice carried up through the hatch, the echo more pronounced than I expected. Up to that point, the inside of the craft was a kind of anechoic chamber. We think it's gravity. What? I called back. He climbed partway up the ladder, stopping just below the opening. It's gravity, he said. That's what you felt in the lab. That's what these things produce. I stared at him for a second. Do you know how? He gave a small shake of his head. If I knew how, he said, you wouldn't be here. That landed heavier than I expected, and for a moment, everything started to align. If what he was saying was even partially correct, if this system was manipulating gravity in a controlled way, then the implications went far beyond anything I'd worked on before. Energy, propulsion, transport, every major limitation we currently face tied in some way to gravity. And this thing manipulated it directly. For the first time since arriving, I felt something else beneath all the confusion, a sense of importance. But Dennis's voice cut straight through it. That's enough, he said. Out you come. I didn't hesitate. I didn't want to be in there anyway. Whatever curiosity I had was quickly overtaken by the awareness of where I was. I climbed back down the ladder, stepped away from the craft as soon as my feet hit the ground. That really was enough for one day. More than enough. The relatively long journey back to the motel passed in a kind of quiet blur. No one spoke, and I didn't try to break that. I spent most of it thinking about why they'd shown me what they had. It didn't feel accidental. It didn't feel like showing off. By the time I got back, I had a clearer sense of it. They needed me to see it. Not just the theory, not just the reactor, but the application, the result. Whatever this technology is capable of, it changes everything. And if I'm going to be involved in trying to understand it, then I need to grasp the scale of what's at stake. Watkins needs help, fresh thinking, and for some reason, they've decided that includes me. I'm exhausted. I'm told I'll be back there in about a week. That gives me time to think. I suspect I'm going to need it. April 13th. Nothing kills enthusiasm quite like waiting. It wasn't a week. It was 3. I don't know what slowed things down, or whether anything changed at all behind the scenes, but whatever momentum I thought we had built, it didn't carry through. By the time I was called back in, the feeling had shifted. Even Dennis felt different. He didn't greet me when I stepped off the plane. No acknowledgement, no nod, nothing to suggest this was anything other than routine. Maybe it was the weather. It had been raining, which felt unusual out there, and the storm back at McCarran had already delayed takeoff by over an hour. It's possible he'd just been standing there longer than expected, waiting for us to arrive. Still, something had changed. The bus ride felt quieter than usual, not just in volume, but in tone. The same route, the same distance, but it carried differently. I didn't ask questions. At this point it was clear enough that asking the wrong thing would get me nowhere, or worse. I just hoped Watkins would be in a better mood. When I arrived at the lab, Watkins was already set up at the workstation. He looked tired, properly tired. A tired that doesn't come from just one bad night's sleep, but from too many in a row. I got the sense he'd been spending far more time at S4 than I had, and at this point, I wasn't even sure if he'd been home. He didn't look up straight away, just continued working through something in front of him, before finally acknowledging me with a brief glance. "You're back," he said. "Looks like it." He gave me a small nod, then gestured toward a set of images laid out across the desk. "Come take a look at this." I stepped in beside him. They were scans, X-ray images, though far more detailed than anything I'd worked with before. Multiple angles, layered views, cross-sections that had been annotated and re-annotated several times over. The reactor was at the center of it all, captured in slices that reveal an internal structure we hadn't been able to observe directly. But the detail didn't make much sense. "What am I looking at?" I asked. Watkins leaned slightly closer, pointing to one of the central sections. "That," he said, "is a magnet to keep the hemisphere in place when it's under electrical load." I followed his finger. A ring-like structure, positioned just beneath the hemisphere. It had a uniformity to it that made the assumption feel reasonable. He continued, moving his finger to a central structure on the image that looked almost like a primitive teapot. "And that's where the fuel sits." "Fuel," I repeated. Watkins stood, walked over to the reactor, and lifted the dome cleanly off the base. Beneath it sat that same small compartment I'd seen in the scans. He removed a cap from the top and placed it carefully on the table. Inside was a chamber, and resting in a shaped well was a small, greyish-brown triangular piece of material. He picked it up without hesitation and held it up to my eyeline. "Fuel," he said. "This is an element with the atomic number of 115. Categorizing that number, that's about the only thing I've managed to do since I got here." He gave a faint, tired smile. "I don't know what it does. I don't know how it's made, but I do know the reactor doesn't work without it. I call it Watkinsium." He placed it back into the chamber with care, resealed it, and set the dome back in place. "And that's it," he said, sitting back down. That's basically everything I know. Nearly a year. He exhaled slowly, the frustration sitting openly on him now. There was a short silence. I wasn't sure if it was my place to say anything, but the longer I looked at the scans, the harder it became to ignore. At least one of those two things isn't right, I said. Watkins looked at me. There was something in his expression. Tired, yes, but also hopeful. I glanced back at the X-rays. That's not a magnet. He didn't respond immediately. I pointed to the image. Magnets show up bright on X-rays. High atomic density, strong absorption. You see the same thing with your element 115 there. Watkinsium, he corrected. Watkinsium, I repeated. It's bright because it's dense. That ring should look the same if it were a magnet. I tapped the scan lightly. But it doesn't. Watkins leaned in slightly. What does that mean? He asked. I took a moment. Let's say it isn't holding a dome in place. Let's say it's doing something else entirely. He waited. What if, I continued, what if it's an accelerator? That got his attention. I traced the structure again with my finger. If this ring is acting like a guide, then it could be shaping a path, controlling direction, not holding anything static, directing movement. Movement of what? He asked. Protons, I said. If you accelerate protons and direct them into a target, you can force a change. You can increase the atomic number. Watkins didn't move. I pointed to the core. If this material is 115, and it's being hit with protons, then you push it to 116. He leaned back slightly. And then? I exhaled slowly. If it's unstable, it decays. Beta plus, I said. Positron emission. I paused, then added more carefully. There are theoretical cases, rare ones, where more unusual transitions can happen, the kind that don't fit neatly into the standard model. Some of those involve the structure of the nucleus changing in ways that produce inverse counterparts. Watkins frowned slightly, meaning, something like an antiparticle, I said. An opposite. If that happens, even briefly, it doesn't last. And when it meets normal matter, he asked. I met his eyes. It annihilates. The word hung there. Completely, I added. Mass into energy. No leftovers. 100% energy output. Watkins just stared at the scans. That could solve, he started, then stopped himself, shaking his head slightly. Energy, he said quietly. That solves energy. I nodded, though more cautiously. It's a step, I said. It explains part of it. He looked back at the reactor. But the gravity? He asked. I shook my head. No idea. There was a brief silence. One step at a time, I said. Science is iterative. You build understanding piece by piece. From somewhere behind us, a voice cut in. Is it now? Dennis. Neither of us had heard him come in. Watkins turned first, and I followed. Dennis stepped further into the room, his expression unreadable. Science isn't always slow, he said. The atomic bomb changed the world in an instant. Watkins replied before I could. The atomic bomb took years, he said. Trial, error, refinement. Dennis looked at him, and there was something in that look that made Watkins stop. "It was built because it had to be built," Dennis said. "There wasn't a choice." He let that sit for a moment and then looked at me. "We're moving forward." "With what?" Watkins asked. "I've heard enough," Dennis said. "It's time to recreate it." The words landed heavily. "That's not possible," I said, before I could stop myself. Dennis didn't react. "Supplies are already on the way. You'll have what you need." "That's not the issue," I said. "We don't understand it well enough. We barely understand how it functions." "You understand enough to begin." "That's not the same thing." Watkins stayed quiet now. "If we try to recreate this without fully understanding it," I continued, "we're guessing. And guessing at this level. You'll proceed," Dennis said. Calm, final. There was nothing left to argue with. The room felt heavier. What had started as curiosity, as an attempt to understand something extraordinary, had shifted into something else. Expectation. Pressure. I looked back at the scans, at the structure we were now expected to recreate. 3 weeks ago, I wasn't even sure this place was real. Now I'm being asked to rebuild something that shouldn't exist at all. And the worst part is, a small part of me believes it might actually be possible. "Go home," Dennis said. "Get some rest, theorize, calculate. I don't care. When the materials arrive, you'll get a call." I've been back in room 27 for 4 days now. I've barely left. Just the occasional trip to the vending machine. The management seems to understand. Fresh sheets appear outside the door each morning without me asking. I've been trying to make sense of it, running through the theory again and again, adjusting it, refining it, trying to close the gaps. But it's not just the work. It's something Dennis said. No choice. He was talking about the atomic bomb, I assume. But the way he said it, it hasn't left me. It's been sitting there, at the edge of every thought, shaping everything else around it. The nights are getting longer. Sleep now comes in fragments, if at all. I'm starting to understand why Watkins looks the way he does. I wasn't prepared for this. Not like this. I'm beginning to regret my decision. April 28th. Few people ever find themselves staring fate in the face as I do now. Apologies if that sounds overtly poetic, but indulge me. When we reach the end, you'll understand why. It was April 26th when I got the call to go back. Somehow, in the days leading up to it, my sense of defeat had shifted into something else. Not confidence, exactly, but perhaps something resembling it. The morning felt different, brighter. I remember thinking briefly that my calculations were solid, that maybe I had something worth bringing back to S4. Even Janet told me to have a good day on the phone. I arrived at the test site at 9 a.m. on the nose. From the moment I stepped off the plane, I could feel that the atmosphere had changed again. Dennis was there, as always, but there was even less of him on display than usual. We walked quickly to the bus, and I found myself matching his pace without even being asked. By the time I got to the lab, of course Watkins was already up and moving. Not working in the calm, tired way I'd seen before, but now in that brittle, over-focused state people reach when they've gone past exhaustion and are being held upright by nerves and caffeine alone. There were materials everywhere: metals, tools, measuring equipment, machined pieces laid out in trays, some of them labelled, most not. Someone had clearly spent the better part of the last week gathering anything they thought might help us reproduce at least one aspect of the reactor's function. Watkins looked at me, then at the stack of calculations in my hand. "Tell me you brought religion," he said. "I brought algebra," I replied. He nodded faintly. "Close enough." And that was how it began. We didn't waste time discussing the broader picture, because there was no broader picture left to discuss. Dennis demanded progress, and progress now had a physical deadline, sitting on the benches around us in the form of metal stock, ceramics, machined housing, vacuum components, and a number of things that looked as though they had been lifted from entirely different programs and dropped here out of pure desperation. We began with the ring. If my theory had any value at all, then the ring structure was the first thing worth trying to approximate. We couldn't recreate the original material, and we certainly couldn't manufacture element 115, so the exercise became less about replication in the pure sense, and more about functional imitation. If the ring truly was a form of compact particle accelerator, then maybe we could build something crude enough to prove the concept, something to keep Dennis happy. That first morning carried the strange optimism that only survives because reality hasn't yet caught up with it. I explained the geometry I thought might work. Watkins argued for a different arrangement, and we met somewhere in the middle. We assembled a rough version by early afternoon and tried to energize it under controlled conditions. It failed immediately. It wasn't a dramatic failure, and in some ways that made it worse. No spectacular confirmation that we had touched something dangerous. It just didn't behave as intended. The field collapsed into noise. The instrumentation hadn't been calibrated, and a power fluctuation somewhere in the setup forced us to cut it before we learned anything useful. Watkins rubbed his face. "Well, that was rubbish." We started over. The second attempt lasted longer, long enough to briefly convince us there might be a pattern in it, a measurable response, something with direction. I remember the two of us leaning in toward the instruments, almost afraid to speak in case we interrupted whatever fragile agreement the system had reached with itself. Then it failed too. By the end of the first day, my calculations were covered in corrections and marginal notes, most of them mine, some of them Watkins, but all of them, at this point, wishful thinking. A few of them were written in a way that suggested one or both of us had forgotten how to hold a pen properly. We didn't leave when we should have. We stayed. We changed dimensions, swapped out materials, adjusted voltages, altered spacing, argued quietly, then stopped arguing because neither of us had the energy to continue. We eventually got a little bit of something I wouldn't characterize as sleep by pushing a few chairs together. Despite Watkins telling me there were bunk beds on site, he was too afraid to leave the lab. The second day was worse. The optimism had vanished with the moonlight, replaced by the dull machinery of repeated failure. We would build, test, fail, strip back and begin again. Every version got close to something, then slipped away before we could define what that something was. There were moments where the instruments would suggest we had brushed against a real effect, but it never held long enough to study. Watkins stopped making jokes for most of that day, which is how I knew things were getting serious. Dennis came in more often than usual. He wouldn't interrupt. He'd just stand there, take in the state of the room, the benches, the floor, us, and then leave again. But every visit seemed shorter than the last, as if patience itself had become another resource the facility was running low on. By the third day, I don't think either of us had slept properly. I'd slept in the lab at some point, or at least I assume I had. I remember sitting down for a minute, closing my eyes, and then becoming aware of my own neck hurting from an angle no sleeping arrangement should ever require. Watkins looked worse. He moved with the detached precision of someone too tired to waste energy on visible frustration. The room had developed its own weather by then. Warm electronics, stale coffee, metal filings, and that faint dry smell the desert seems to press into everything, even underground. But I had figured one thing out, one very important thing. We were trying to do the impossible. We were children playing with a magic set without instructions. We couldn't make magic happen because we didn't understand the trick. We didn't have the knowledge, and no amount of trial and error was going to brute force our way into it. I had a growing suspicion that the material itself may have been the key. Not just the geometry, not just the configuration, but the composition itself. The ring, the chamber, the entire structure. It wasn't just design. There was substance behind it. The linear accelerator back at Stanford had been nearing completion when I left. Over 2 miles long, built with the most advanced materials we could produce on Earth. What we were attempting in the lab was a compact version of something far more advanced than that, using materials that were, at best, approximations. We were trying to recreate something we didn't understand, with tools that weren't sufficient, under conditions that didn't allow for failure. It was impossible. Sometime in the afternoon, after another attempt failed in a way that was pointless to even write down, Dennis came in and stayed in the doorway. Nobody said anything at first. Watkins stared down at the bench in defeat. I was pretending to review figures I'd already looked at 3 times, tracing the same lines with my eyes without actually seeing them. I knew Dennis could see it. We were no closer than we had been 2 days earlier. If anything, we were further away, more tired, more uncertain, less able to even trust the small pieces of understanding we thought we'd gained. It felt like minutes passed. Then Dennis finally spoke. "Well, boys," he said, "it looks like drastic measures have to be taken." There was no emphasis in his voice. Watkins looked up first. "What does that mean?" he asked. Dennis didn't answer him. Instead, he opened the door, leaned out into the corridor, and shouted, "Barry!" A few seconds later, a man in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, stepped out from another lab further down the hall. He approached with the expression of someone who'd been interrupted in the middle of something he already resented. Dennis pointed down the corridor. "Send your partner in here," he said. "We need to borrow him. Tell him to grab his shit and get in here." Barry looked from Dennis to us and back again. He didn't argue. He just nodded once and disappeared. The room felt different after that. Any lingering illusion that this was still a research exercise, with all the room for error that research implies, vanished completely. Dennis stepped back in and looked at the two of us. "Come with me," he said. We followed him. As we walked past the room Barry came out of, his partner emerged and joined us, still scrambling to get his lanyard over his head. Barry led us down a corridor I hadn't seen before, one less finished than the others, more functional, less concerned with appearance. At the end of it was an elevator I hadn't seen, larger than the normal ones, heavier in its construction, the kind of lift built for freight or machinery rather than people. This time Dennis used his keycard and then pressed the call button, and the doors opened with a mechanical heaviness I felt in my chest. Inside, the panel listed 27 levels. I stared at the numbers for a second longer than necessary. I remember trying to comprehend how much more vast the range would be if its installations all had underground levels. Dennis pressed the bottom button. The descent seemed to go on for far too long, but I did get a look at Barry's partner. Tall, lanky, looked a bit like a greenhorn, like me. Looked like he might struggle to grow a beard. As we descended, I could feel the distance accumulating around me, the soft changes in pressure, the way the machinery sounded slightly different the lower we went, and the awareness that an extraordinary amount of rock now sat above our heads. When the doors finally opened, level 27 was waiting. It didn't look like the rest of S4. Clean corridors, even lighting, the home comforts of a vending machine. But this felt older, more raw, more like infrastructure than facility. The walls looked less finished. The air was cooler, there was a breeze. There was more space, but less comfort. Ahead of us stretched what looked at first like a transport corridor. But I soon realized corridor was too modest a word. It went on in both directions, almost absurdly far, vanishing into dimness. Not a hallway so much as a horizontal shaft, broad enough for vehicles. I was almost more impressed than when I saw the hangars in the side of the hill. There was a jeep waiting there. Old. I found myself wondering if it had been brought down decades earlier and simply never taken back up. Dennis got in, and we did the same. The drive lasted around 35 minutes, perhaps a little more. The engine echoing for miles and back was excruciatingly loud. I tried to cover my ears without appearing weak, instead pretending to catch a few minutes of sleep. The shaft continued with such relentless consistency that it produced a strange mental effect. Distance lost all meaning. I even made up a new measurement for distance by counting the even sections where the tunnel wall was nothing but bedrock, clearly a feature of this incredible piece of engineering. No one spoke much, not that we really could anyway. There didn't seem much to say. Eventually, the shaft opened into something so much larger that my brain resisted it at first. A cavern. Not a cave in the ordinary sense. Not anything rough or intimate. A chamber so vast that it seemed to reject normal scale. I had no idea how deep we were. The ceiling was somewhere far above us, too high for the eye to latch onto comfortably. The walls curved away into shadow. You could have thrown a stone upward with your full strength, and it would have disappeared before getting anywhere near the top. When Dennis shut the jeep door, the sound continued for about 10 seconds. That's the thing I remember most clearly, the way even the smallest noises lasted for seconds, hanging in the air, flattening out and slowly disappearing into the space. It made every movement feel consequential. We walked a little further in. I noticed the floor beneath me was cracking, like glass, and in that moment it hit me. I knew where we were. The floor was covered in a layer of smooth trinitite, named after the Trinity nuclear test in '45. The residue forms only in the extreme heat of an atomic explosion. We were standing in the center of what was once an underground nuclear detonation. Somehow the explosion had formed a vast cavern. Perhaps, like the trinitite, the walls too had fused solid in the heat. I can only speculate. After all, the underground tests were mostly classified. Dennis stopped and turned to us. We're going to cut into one. A reactor. I was too tired to respond properly at first. That's fine, I said, more automatically than thoughtfully. But we won't learn much from that. The X-rays already gave us the internal structures. We've mapped most of it. Cutting into it just breaks it. Dennis looked at me and said, "We're going to cut into it while it's running." That woke me up. "No," I said immediately. "Absolutely not." Watkins didn't say anything, but I could feel him straighten beside me. "You can't do that," I continued. "If it's active, if it's doing what we think it's doing, then cutting into it under load is suicidal. It isn't just damage, Dennis. It's a release, a violent one." He let me continue. "If the reaction chain is even half what I think it is, and if there's annihilation happening anywhere in the system, then interfering with containment while it's active could trigger a massive energy discharge. You're talking about cutting into a running reactor with no understanding of what state it's in when it's operating. That could be a death sentence." Dennis's face didn't change. "I assure you, not doing it," he said, "is an even more certain death sentence." That sat with me for a second, and I kind of knew what he meant already. Then he kept talking. He'd told us he'd been in charge of Project Galileo for 2 years, since the Russians had been removed from direct involvement. That stopped me more effectively than anything else he'd said so far. The Russians. All this time above ground, the Cold War had shaped every headline, every fear, every argument about deterrence and survival. We had built enough weapons to destroy the planet over and over again, while somewhere beneath the desert, buried under mountains and dry lake beds, people from both sides had been working on the same program. The contradiction of it felt almost unbearable. All of that expense, all that anxiety, all that machinery of division. And here, of all places, there had apparently been cooperation. Dennis said it had changed. Orders had changed with it. They had been told to make a breakthrough before the Soviets did. Deliver results first. Move faster. Win. If that word can even be used for something like this. Watkins asked very quietly, and if you don't? Dennis looked at him for a moment. "People like me," he said, "don't get fired." He didn't need to say the rest, but he did. We're killed. There was no performance in it, no self-pity, just fact. That was the source of the pressure. Not ambition, not patriotism in the polished language men like Edward Teller use when they want to make impossible things sound noble. Fear. very old, very immediate fear. It strips away every justification and leaves only survival underneath. Dennis looked from Watkins to me. "So when I tell you we're moving forward," he said, "understand what that means. This isn't abstract for me or for you. So a few days from now, the three of you will haul the reactor, the amplifier, the emitter, a laser cutter, and a power unit down here, and you're going to do what you have to do." It felt like I was being sentenced. I'd been found guilty of curiosity, of ambition to change the world for the better. And it felt all too fitting that my demise would likely take place at the epicenter of an explosion that in some twisted way represented exactly the kind of unchecked technological pursuit I had always stood against. Just on a scale I could never have imagined. He then told me I would go back to the motel, gather my things, and be ready to move onto the base after the test. For the foreseeable future, he said, which was as close to optimism as the phrase was willing to get. The return journey from that point onward has a strange quality in my memory. It felt slowed down, every part of it. The jeep ride back through the endless transport level, the elevator climbing all 27 levels, the bus ride out toward the plane. I noticed absurdly small things with total clarity. The cracked rubber on the jeep's floor mat, the way the elevator buttons had worn smooth around the edges, the sound the bus suspension made over uneven ground, the bumpy rhythm of the ride, the exact shade of the desert light across the dry lake bed. Every moment after that cavern felt like it might be the last time I would experience that particular thing, not in some grand dramatic sense, in a simple one. The ordinary texture of life suddenly seemed full of details I had never thought to preserve before. I savoured the bus ride back in a way that now feels almost embarrassing to admit. The world above ground looks so temporary from inside that bus. Watkins and Barry's partner didn't say a word. They had a look of resignation in their eyes, and I was beginning to wonder if I shared it too. I wonder if they were savouring these moments as much as I was, or whether they were desperately trying to form contingency plans in their heads, escape routes. By the time the plane lifted off, I knew one thing clearly. Whatever remained of my old life had already begun to fall away. And now I'm back here, room 27, writing this while everything still feels close enough to touch. I don't know what time it is. I'm not sure what the date is. I don't know if I'm being melodramatic or simply respecting the situation with the yield it's due. Tomorrow, or the day after, or whenever that call comes, I may be taken back to help cut into an active reactor built from principles we barely understand, inside a mountain beneath the Nevada desert, because men with guns and classifications and timelines are more afraid of being second than they are of being vaporized. That is such a ridiculous sentence that I almost want to laugh. But I'm not sure I can anymore. I think I've done enough laughing at impossible things. The truth is much less entertaining once it stays true for long enough. I'm tired beyond anything I've known before, and yet I don't think I'll sleep. If this entry reads strangely, that's because I've been more awake in the journey back than I've been in my entire life. I am tired, but I don't think I'll sleep. Just yet. May 3rd. I'm still at the motel. The last few days have been quiet, in a way I didn't expect. I've been spending most of my time by the pool, if you can call it that. The water's a little too still, the tiles a little too worn, but it's enough. The bar's been generous, or at least consistent. I've had as much watered-down vodka as I care to tolerate. There was a moment where I considered leaving, just packing what I could carry and driving until the desert gave way to something else, possibly a solution. But that thought didn't last long. The people I'm dealing with, they don't seem like the kind you disappear from. And if I'm being honest with myself, I'd rather take my chances with the laser cutter than spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. I did try to calculate it, the probability that nothing goes wrong. I sat down with it properly, worked through the variables as best as I could with what little I actually understand about the system. The number I landed on was 43%, just enough to give me hope, and just enough certainty to make the first couple of days difficult. It took a little while, but eventually something shifted. I wouldn't say I'm at peace with it. That feels too complete. But I have reached a point where I can sit with it without trying to change it. I'm not sick in the conventional sense, but I imagine this is close to how someone might feel if they knew their time was limited. Then again, aren't we all sick in our own way? Death waits for no one. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't adjust. The only difference here is that I've been given something resembling a timeline. There's a strange kind of clarity in that. I've been thinking back over everything that happened. The protest, the coffee, Teller. If I hadn't turned at that exact moment, if I hadn't knocked that cup from his hand, none of this would have followed. It's a simple chain of events, but it's led somewhere I couldn't ever have predicted, even in the broadest sense. I've decided to leave this journal here. I'm going to tuck it somewhere behind the bed, out of sight but not impossible to find. If things go the way I expect them to, then there's a chance someone might come across it eventually. If that happens, I hope it makes some kind of sense, or at least enough of it does. So if you're reading this, then you've already found it. I'd say the motel deserves a solid 5-star rating. It's been a fitting kind of comfort, all things considered. Enjoy the ironies you come across in life. They can be funny if you catch them at the right moment. And if you feel like doing me a favour, call EG&G. Tell them Janet was excellent at her job. They should name the airline after her. Anyway, I think that's everything. Be seeing ya. That was the last entry in the journal. I did call EG&G, by the way. They didn't confirm anything, but the person on the other end did pause before they hung up. I'll take that as enough. Thanks for staying with us here at the Dreamland Motel. If you enjoyed tonight's story, feel free to like, subscribe, share it with someone who might appreciate a quieter kind of mystery, and leave your own comment card below. I do read them. If you'd like to support the motel more directly, you can find ways to do that in the description. We'd appreciate it. We'll be here when you need us again. Good night.